Hi everyone, 3.6 genetics. The objective for today is students will be able to identify how genetics and environment can impact behavior by explaining how dominant and recessive genes can impact your heredity. So first we're going to focus on genetics. Over here is a great diagram on your cell. Inside of your cell is a nucleus. Inside of that nucleus is a chromosome, and one little tiny piece of that chromosome is your DNA. And that's what makes you, you. Behavior geneticists are the ones who study this. They study heredity and how environment impacts or affects our behavior. DNA is a molecule that contains genetic information and makes up chromosomes. So chromosome is this, what we see here, and it's made up of little DNA structures that you can find within a nucleus. Genome is genetic material that makes you human. And this is important because we map our genomes to identify similarities as well as genetic disorders. So this can be extremely helpful when trying to identify if you have a genetic disorder. Molecular genetics focuses on specific genes in particular. So they really kind of narrow in on specific genes and what those genes or how those genes impact behavior or just overall development. Now, why we study this in psychology is because there is a belief or a thought process that we are born with certain genetic traits. And those genetic traits can lend themselves to specific psychological disorders. But what we're seeing is that there has to be a combination of nature versus nurture. So for example, you are born with a genetic trait for, let's say, depression. But what we see happening in some cases is some people get depressed and others don't. So what we think is happening is there's some sort of nurture or environmental trigger that triggers the depression to happen in some individuals that have that trait and not other individuals that have that trait. And this is where we see the nature versus nurture come into play. So nature is your specific genetics. The fact that genetics determine our behavior, our personality traits, and our abilities are in our nature. Nurture is the environment that surrounds you. So your upbringing, life experiences, we are nurtured to behave in certain ways. We study nature versus nurture in twin studies, where we have the same genetic makeup or very similar genetic makeup, depending on whether it's an identical twin or fraternal twin. So identical twins have the same genetic makeup. So if they've been separated at birth or very close to it, then we can study and see what similarities they have in common versus what is different. And that can kind of give us some insight on nature versus nurture, or the environmental influences that may impact you. Heritability is when behavior geneticists can mathematically estimate how likely you are to inherit characteristics. So there are certain characteristics that they can determine that you could potentially inherit, and they calculate that mathematically to determine that. And you're going to learn a little bit more about that in your assignment today when we talk about dominant versus recessive genes and how those can play a role in your nature or in your development. And that is it for today.